It's hard to believe that in the middle of August. Been a nice morning to be outside and worship, wouldn't it? It's hard to imagine. Glad that you're here. God's blessed us again with another Lord's Day, a beautiful day. We've been talking about worship. We're talking about giving. Paul here at the Corinthians, evidently there's, this is because of a great famine, maybe in Acts 11, Agabus, talking about the great famine that's going to happen in and around Judea. But Paul writes what Trevor just read in his first letter in 16. Use 16, 1 and 2 for a number of reasons. One, it says that there was a gathering of the church there at Corinth, and it happened to be on the first day of the week. And so he says on the first day of the week in verse 2, and every time there's a first day of the week, they would gather. And so obviously one of the things that they did is they must have had a church treasury. We assume that because he says, notice, concerning the collection for the saints. Notice what he says, for the saints. He said, I've directed the churches in Galatia. Now, interesting that we see that Galatia and Macedonia and Achaia, great big regions. This was a widespread collection. It wasn't just to those in Macedonia. There was 4 providences in Macedonia. And a couple of the well-known churches there in Macedonia, well, one of them was Philippi. Remember Acts 16. Acts 16, Paul has the call to go into Macedonia, and he goes into Macedonia. You remember he goes to Philippi, and Philippi was, in Thessalonica, they were free cities, Roman colonies. So that meant that they weren't set up like the Roman government was. They had some freedoms that other cities did not have. But in any case, he goes into Philippi, and there weren't very many Jews there. It was mostly Gentiles because there wasn't any synagogues there. Remember, you took at least 10 men before synagogue would be set up, according to the custom of the Jews. And there wasn't. And so when he goes into Philippi, you remember the woman Lydia was by the river. Well, it's customary there at Philippi that they would go pray and have their meetings by the river since there wasn't a synagogue. So here is Lydia in her household at the riverside. And then Thessalonica was the capital of Macedonia, and he goes to Thessalonica, and he also goes to Berea. Those 3 cities are 3 of the cities that's in Macedonia. And so he says, I want each one of you. Notice it's an individual thing here in 1 Corinthians 16:2. He said, I want each one of you to put aside and save as he may prosper, so that there be no collections when I come. It's interesting that he says, I want everything ready when I get there. I don't want to have to wait and take up collection. Obviously, they weren't going from house to house to take up collections, but when they met, they would bring their collections. They would already have it ready, and they would put it in the treasury there at Corinth when they came on the first day of the week. Now let's turn to, with that, let's turn to 2 Corinthians. I told you we'd be looking at 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. We're going to do that. Paul writes again this letter to the Corinthians. It's been a year or so. And notice where he writes. We'll read a few verses. He says, now, brethren, in verse 1 of 2 Corinthians 8, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given in the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality. For I testify that according to their ability and beyond their ability, they gave of their own accord, begging us with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints, and this not as we had expected, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. Now, I want you to notice some of the things that are actually written here in these first 5 verses. Now, he's writing this to encourage Corinth. In 9, he's encouraging the Macedonians by the generosity, supposedly, of the Corinthians. Now, Macedonia, there had been many wars throughout that land. Not only that, but the Roman government had taken their silver and gold. Not only that, but they had heavily taxed their copper mines and their iron mines. They had not allowed them to cut the trees and sell them and export them for others to use for wood, buildings, that kind of thing. So economically, they had been taken down to very, very poor region. Macedonia and its cities once thrived, but now were very, very poor. And so he says, I want you to know about the grace of God. Grace is used quite often in these 2 chapters. But the grace of God which has been given, he says, in those areas of Macedonia where the churches are. We know there was one in Philippi, because he wrote the letter to Philippi called the Philippians letter. We know Thessalonica had a church there. He wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Achaia is where Corinth was. And so we know there's a church there because we're reading a letter that he wrote to the Corinthians. And notice in 2, he says that in the great ordeal of affliction, they were under a lot of affliction. There were a lot of problems there. And of course, if you know about Rome, you know that in Rome there were as many slaves there as they were free people. That's why Paul writes to some of the slaves concerning their masters and concerning their Christianity they now had. And it said that slaves there in the churches, they didn't get much. But what they would do is, it's told by history that many of the slaves would fast 2 or 3 days a week and take whatever it is that they could get. And they would give it to the saints. That's how the gospel message changed the people when their hearts received it. To think that a slave that didn't get much but bread and water did not work basically for a living, but was under the master's control, and he got whatever the master would give him. To think that they would take and they would not eat for 2 or 3 days a week, just so they would have something that they could store up, whatever it was, not just necessarily money. and give to the saints and give to the church. Give it back to God. And so he says, their abundance of joy and deep poverty. They were in deep poverty. They had very little. They struggled. Like I said, the Roman government had stripped them of all their economic wealth and power. And wars had taken their tolls. And to fight those wars, the Roman government had taken their treasury, basically, and taxed their copper and iron heavily. And it says their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth. Notice, the wealth of their liberality. He's talking about their giving. I like what it says. They gave sacrificially. They didn't have it, but they gave it. That's what it's saying. We see instances, even in Timothy and other places, James, about the rich. The rich young ruler had everything. Jesus said, go and sell what you have and give to the needy. And he said, I can't do that. But here's people that didn't have it, but yet whatever they had, they gave. They sacrificially gave. And they gave, notice, an abundance of joy they gave it. I find that interesting. Because when you don't have it and you've got to struggle for it and you give it, that's out of joy. That's out of the joy of the heart. Nobody had a gun to their head to give it to the church. But they gave it as they could. And they gave liberally. Probably not very much because they didn't have much. But when it talks about liberally, it's not talking about the amount. It's not saying $1, $100, $1,000, $1 million. The widow with her 2 mites in Mark 12 gave liberally. What she did is Jesus saw her and saw the 2 mites, which is about, they think about 2 cents in our day and time, which if someone dropped 2 cents, if you saw someone drop 2 cents, you would think, boy, they're not givers. But Jesus looked and looked into the heart, looked in the attitude of the widow that gave 2 mites, 2 cents in our time. And see, he said she gave of herself. She gave all that she had. Every bit. Is that not trust in God? And so they were wealthy of their liberality. They were joyfully giving. Somehow they understood and they gathered this joy of giving. We do that sometimes on Christmas, do we not? We have our kids, grandkids and stuff, and we joyfully give to them. For I testify in 3 that according to their ability, notice, they gave according to their ability. That's what he said in 1 Corinthians 16, as you've been purposed. But beyond their ability. I don't know how they did that. But they gave what they could and then found more to give. That's what it's saying. And notice they gave of their own accord. They gave voluntarily all that they had plus. He's talking about Macedonia. And you see, when you read 1 Corinthians 16, he's telling the church there at Corinth, I want you to give. We got some saints that need help. So at least we see in the New Testament, all the churches can gather together to help other churches. And it appears to me that when he's talking to Corinth, he's saying, not only, here's what I want you to do, not only do you give what you normally give, but I want you to sink deep while you're at home. And I want you to give to sin to the saints. And they gave voluntarily. We don't command people to give against their will. We're going to look at that in 2 Corinthians 9. This is a different kind of giving. When we look at these few verses, it's not like the Old Testament giving. You see, nowhere are we told in our letters that are written to the churches for us to understand, are we told to tithe? Nowhere. That was compulsory under the Old Testament to tithe. God commanded under the law that 10% of whatever it was, immediately, the first fruits immediately went to God. They didn't have any choice. They may break the law and not do it, but it's compulsory. And it's interesting that as you read what Jesus begins with the Sermon on the Mount and talks about, when we're told in Acts 20 it's more blessed to give than to receive. And then you read about how we have so much better blessings and promises in Hebrews than they had. He wants us to give from the heart, knowing the blessings that he's given us, the grace of God, is what he talks about here in verse 1. By the grace of God, the Macedonians could give what they gave. Interesting. That God made sure that they gave from the heart what they needed to give, or what they wanted to give. Not needed, but wanted to give. I find that interesting. And so we have free will offerings today. You remember there were free will offerings back. We looked at the tabernacle and they took up collection. We looked at the temple and they took up collection. They gave their silver and gold. They dropped their earrings, bracelets, whatever, and melted them down. They came rich out of Egypt and they gave whatever they had for the temple and the vessels and stuff in it. And they gave her their money. We talked about there was places where they gave in the temple. 13 receptacles in the women's court. And so in the Old Testament, they were to give 10%, but they also gave for other reasons, much like we do today. Next month, we'll be taking up a collection for EEM. This is, we've been doing this for about 16 years. We did it the first time they did it. We've been doing it every time that they've had one. They used to have it every other year. Now they have it every year. And the reason they have it every other year used to be called the $1 Million Sunday. It's because they were starting out and they needed Bibles in certain schools and certain regions of the Ukraine. Now they need 2 million plus because they have put so many in so many schools, and now that it is spreading throughout the whole, not just there, they're going to pull in other areas. But the Ukraine has been begging them to put them in schools. The school what we would call the school administrators, you know the story. Ben comes here and talks to us. We see a little film or something to talk about it every year. Now it's every year, and they need over $2 million this year. And we don't take it out of our treasury. We've been giving it over and beyond our treasury. We mentioned it 4 or 5 months ago when we first got the information. So we ought to be preparing for it. That's what Paul was saying. He doesn't say how long it's going to take him to get there, but obviously it's at least a year. And he says, I want you to give, and I want you to give every time you come, and I want you to, every time you come, give and have it ready. So whenever I do get there, you can give it to me and I can take it. And he also says there'll be some that I will send with letters so that you'll know who took it and that they're honorable people, people of integrity. They're not going to steal any of it, but they'll be held accountable. That's what he said in 3 and 4 of what Trevor read. But notice in 4 is an interesting verse also. Those of Macedonia, says, they begged us, Paul writes, with much urging for the favor of participation in the support of the saints. He says, not only did they give voluntarily, but they gave persistently, and not only persistently, but they begged us and begged us and begged us to take what we could get them. It's almost like Paul is saying, I felt like they had just really were giving and giving and giving and giving and giving over and over and over and above, but that's what they wanted. And if that's what they wanted, they said, we want you to take it. We don't want you to think about it. We want you to take it. Don't worry about us. God will take care of us. The grace of God is why we're allowed to give what we're giving. And the grace of God will take care of it, care of us after you receive it from us. It says they begged him to take it. Interesting. They didn't have it, but they gave it plus. They gave it joyfully. They gave it liberally. They gave it persistently. They gave it voluntarily. And so Paul writes this to encourage Corinth. And we'll find out why Corinth needs encouraging as we look further into the 2 chapters. But I want you to know, verse 5, I think, is the pivotal verse. Why in the world would a poor region and a poor people, afflicted people, economically depressed people, what is it that they had that many churches don't have? Notice. And this, he said, we didn't expect it from Macedonia. We knew how poor they were. But we didn't expect this liberality, and we didn't expect them to beg us. We didn't expect them to just voluntarily go beyond much our expectations. But he says, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. I think that puts it all in perspective. Why did they do that? Why did the widow give just 2 mites? It's interesting because when you read the story, the widow, here's the rich. And man, you know, they're just piled it in there. You see, the rich gave her the surplus. It's like, I've done everything I need to this week. I got a little bit here. I'll just give it. Not necessarily in planning, but they'd come in and they'd give it. People could see them giving a lot of money, and they'd say, oh, wow, let's pat this go boy on the back. And Jesus sees the widow. And probably nobody even paid any attention to her. And she comes in. Jesus watches her. And she puts 2 mites in. And what did Jesus do? He calls his disciples over. He says, come here. Hey, y'all, come here. Come here. Come here. You see that? You see that lady there? That widow right there? Do you see what she gave? She doesn't have anything but 2 mites to her name. That's it. You know what she gave? Disciples, listen to me. You know what she gave? She gave it all. That's because she gave herself to the Lord and to his will. She trusted in God. She knew that tomorrow somehow would take care of itself. What do you think the disciples thought? I don't know. Because we know the disciples gave up all also to follow Jesus. Remember? He says, put it all away and come follow me. Be fishers of men. And they did. But it says they gave it all. Read down just a few so we can move on. We're done for today, basically. There's a lot I've got to say, but I don't have time. But anyway, 6 says, so we urge Titus that as he had previously made a beginning, so he would also complete in you this gracious work as well. In other words, he's saying, I'm going to send Titus to you. Titus, we know there's a book that Paul writes to Titus. We're looking at Timothy right now. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are what they call pastoral epistles. They were written specifically for preachers. So Titus was an evangelist. And he had done much in the way of ministry for Paul. So he urged Titus. He said, but just as you abound in everything, verse 7, in faith and utterance and knowledge and in all earnestness in the love we inspired in you, see that you abound in this gracious work also. Talking to the Corinthians says, look what I've just told you, and I'm sending Titus to you. So I want you to abound in this same work also. Remember, I told you in my first letter. 1 Corinthians, what we know is 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, 3 and 4. That was just read this morning by Trevor. He says, that's what I told you, but I want you to abound in it. I'm not speaking this, verse 8, as a command, but as proving through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love also. I find that very, very interesting. And when you read chapter 9, which we'll get to, not now, you understand what he's saying. He said, I'm not asking you to give to the saints as a command. I'm asking you to give out of your heart because you love God. Interesting. We'll cover that more in chapter 9. But he goes on to say, for you know, verse 9, the grace, there's the word grace again. It keeps coming up. Gracious to you in a couple verses up. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through what? His poverty might become sick. Remember what he said? Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He didn't come to the earth to take anything or to have anything. He left all the wealth. He left everything. All creation was his, of the Godhead. Philippians 2 says he left it all behind. He became poor. Speaking of how we consider material wealth, rich and poor. He was rich. He had it all, but he left it all and came to earth to do what? Philippians 2 tells us. To do what? To make us rich by dying on the cross. And we're rich in spiritual blessings. We're richer than the richest 10 people in America if we're a Christian. Do we realize that? If you talk about the riches that God gives us in our spiritual being, we're richer than actually everybody in the world today that's not a Christian. That's what he's saying in 9. 10 says, I give my opinion on this matter, for this is to your advantage. Who were the first to begin a year ago, not only to do this, but also to desire to do it. He's saying, when I left this command with you, or this entreaty with you, I should say, he said, because I didn't do his command, so I shouldn't use that. He says, his entreaty with you, he said, man, you were excited. You had a desire to do it. This is something you want to do. Well, something happened. Something happened. You know why they want to get you when you're in the store? You know, they have a lot of, the word escapes me right now. Senior moment came upon me just then. But muscular dystrophy and some of those, you remember Jerry Lewis telethons and stuff. And you watch it and you get emotional about it. And you get kind of caught up. And I read where many of the pledges that are given, see, they can't, just because you call in and say, yeah, bill me $50. My name's Ernie. I live in Tuttle. See, they can't force me to give $50. And they say many of the pledges that are given are sincere, I think, are sincere. They think are sincere. You call in, you're sincerely wanting to give. But what happens when the telethon is over? They say many of those pledges are just forgotten. They never get that $50 Ernie said he'd give. Why do you think a car salesman or somebody wants you then to buy? Because they know when you leave, you probably won't. And it's kind of like, that's what Paul is saying here. Hey, man, you were up for it. Man, you said, okay, yeah, we're going to go home. We're going to look at what we got. And yeah, we're going to give, and we're going to give, and we're going to give. And he says, You had a desire. But now, what about finishing it? Doing it also so that just as there was a readiness to desire to do it, so there may be also the completion of it by your ability. Something had waned in that time. That's why he's talking about the Macedonians begging us. They had given themselves to the Lord. Their heart was totally in it. And they didn't forget. They kept giving and they kept begging us to take it. And you had the same desire, but somewhere along the line, what happened? You Corinthians. That's why he's telling the Corinthians here and trying to spur them on by saying, look at the Macedonians. But now finish it. He said, let's get it done. Let's get it done. For if the readiness is present, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. He's telling church at Corinth, they had problems too. But he said, I want you to give as you've been prospered. That's what I told you. As you can, as you have the ability to give. I'm not asking for more. If you got $100, I'm not asking you to put 200 in it. You don't have it. I'm not asking you if Chuck puts in 100 and Nick puts in 100. Ernie, if you don't have 100, you don't put 100 in. That's what he's saying. We don't look at what somebody else gives. He says, I want each one of you in 1 Corinthians 16:2. Each one of you to will and to do and to give is what he says. It's an individual thing. We see so many on TV. And they talk about money, talk about money, talk about money, talk about money. And maybe sometimes the church goes one or two evils. They never talk about it, which we haven't talked about it much. I think we're a giving congregation. Like I said, this is only second or maybe third at the most lesson that I've actually had on just giving. I've mentioned it some. Or we talk about it all the time. Neither one of them's good. Because we've talked about giving. God don't need it. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. God don't need it. He's not saying give $1 because he's going to use $1. That's not what he's saying. He said it needs to come from the heart. We need to understand what giving is. We need to give. We need to share. We need to give it freely, voluntarily, willingly, persistently. We'll talk about more. I want to talk about chapter 9, maybe next week. I was going to do it something maybe this morning or something tonight. I think I'll do it next week. I think we need it to understand what God expects. How much does he expect us to give? Why does he want us to give? What does he want us to give? And he talks to the Corinthians about that in chapter 9. Thank you so much for your attention. We talked about the last verse in chapter 9, that Christ was the unspeakable gift. He gave everything for you and for me. And now, because of the blood that he shed and the purchased church that he bought, Acts 20:28, we're able to come together and to share fellowship with not only each one of us, but with God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit that resides within us. If you're not part of that, or if you've left that, or if you need any help on your journey to heaven, won't you come now as we stand and sing?
Kneel at the cross, Christ will meet you there.